Willkommen zu einer neuen Folge Interview mit einem Imker. Ihr seht gleich die erste Folge, die wir auf Englisch gemacht haben. Ich wollte nur vorher nochmal klarstellen, das soll nicht zur Gewohnheit werden und das ist und bleibt ein deutscher Kanal. Aber ich hatte die Chance, mit Randy Oliver mich zu unterhalten und er hat mir 30 Minuten seiner Zeit geschenkt. Und so eine Gelegenheit schlägt man nicht aus. Dementsprechend haben wir jetzt eine Folge auf Englisch gemacht. Ich probiere es so gut es geht zu untertiteln, so dass ihr bitte, wenn ihr, also am besten, schaltet einfach die YouTube-Untertitel ein. Ich probiere die so gut es geht so zu machen, dass sie auch in Bienensprache sind und so. Ja, und ansonsten, die nächste Folge wird wieder Deutsch, aber wie gesagt, diese Chance lässt man sich nicht entgehen. Und jetzt viel Spaß mit der Folge. Welcome to another episode of Interview with a Beekeeper. I'm very honored, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion now. We have as our guest Randy Oliver here. Welcome, and Randy on the show.
Thank you, Jan.
So it's the first time we are doing this in English, so excuse me if I sometimes lose my words a little bit, but can you explain us? You just recently published your latest study on pollen patties, and could you explain us a little bit what you did during that trial and how it was done, what was the result, and so on?
Certainly. Well, back in 2013, let's backtrack a little bit. I did a comparative trial, and the reason is that in the United States we have a magazine called Consumer Reports. And unrelated to beekeeping. And what Consumer Reports does is for their readers, they test out various products, whether it's computers or refrigerators or automobile products, and they do an unbiased testing of those products. The beekeeping industry doesn't have anybody doing that. The institutions are hesitant to do it because they don't want to mention any brand names because they may have problems with the manufacturers. And even the bee magazines are hesitant to do it because their advertisers are those that would be tested. So they are hesitant to do that. Luckily, the publisher in American Bee Journal is willing to let me even test their products and publish the results. And I really take my hat off to them for allowing me to do that. So back in 2013, I tested a number of the pollen subs and also some homebrew from the commercial pollen subs and also some homebrew formulations and got clear results. Number one, demonstrated very clearly that it can be of great benefit to feeding a pollen sub if there is a pollen dearth in the environment. Since then, I've also done some experiments showing that if pollen is already abundant in the environment, there's no benefit to feeding pollen subs. The bees just take the sub, they suck the sugar out of it, and they kick out all the protein components out the front door. So it's a waste of money to feed it then. So feeding pollen sub is not for everybody. But for us commercial beekeepers in California, where we get paid an insane amount of money now for almond pollination. But just to put it in perspective, when I started pollinating almonds, I got paid $10 a hive for pollination. This year, we're getting paid $230 per colony for our stronger colonies, which are graded for strength. So we get paid by about $25 for every frame covered with bees. So we now have a very strong incentive to make sure our colonies are as strong as they can be. In late February, we get graded in late February. So the colonies haven't had a whole lot of time to build up yet. By that time, there's very little bloom before then. So the critical thing is you have to have your colonies strong going into the winter in November, so you can have a large cluster come February for grading. So it's very cost effective for us to do whatever is necessary to go into the winter with a large cluster. The problem is that in California, especially with climate change, it doesn't rain for much of the year. Where I live, we may not see a single drop of rain for 5 months during the summer. not a single drop of rain. Well, I'll tell you, that really impacts the production of floral resources as far as pollen or nectar. We don't have any autumn, late season pollen flow to speak of. So most California commercial beekeepers move their hives out of the area to another state where there is either irrigated cropland or natural rainfall, where they can build their colonies up for winter, and then they bring them back for almond pollination. A number of years ago, I discovered that and I did that for 25 years, moved my colonies up to irrigated lucerne in another state. Yeah. And there were plants, a native plant there that produced a lot of high quality pollen in the fall, and my colonies were in great shape. But my desire is not to be a trucker. My desire is to be a beekeeper. So I got tired of all the trucking involved. And when Varroa arrived, that made it difficult because now you're managing your hives, which are, a 3-hour drive away from your home base. So I didn't like that. So I started experimenting with supplemental feeding with artificial diet pollen subs during the summer, and found out, wow, it's more labor, but less trucking. And we're home every night for dinner. So that was a cost benefit thing. And I found out I can manage my colonies much better for Varroa if they're home than if they're in another state. So for that reason, I had great interest in the development of artificial diets for honeybees. And I ran that trial in 2013 to compare the diets that were on the market. And as a control group, a negative control group, well, I ran a negative and a positive control group on that trial, where the negative control group was just patties of sugar with the same amount of sugar that were in the protein patties. Yeah. So somebody couldn't say, oh, well, Randy, it's just the sugar feeding alone that made the difference. Okay, so you have to control for the sugar in the patty. Then as a positive control, I made patties of natural pollen with sugar added. So trapped natural pollen from bees with sugar added to compare that. So I had a positive control of the ideal diet, quote, ideal diet, assuming that natural pollen is the best, and that is a big assumption. And then the negative controls, and all the artificial diets fell in performance between the two. So that validated the experimental design. So if you do want to run an experiment to test pollen subs, run a negative control of sugar and a positive control of natural pollen. Yeah. And then and what we'd be hoping for in an artificial diet would be to have diets that actually outperform the natural pollen. And that may indeed be possible. So since 2013, a couple of new products came on the market, and a group of commercial beekeepers down in our country had developed, with the aid of a nutritionist from Mexico, had developed their own formulation, the homebrew formulation, that they felt was very, very successful. And I was down speaking to them, and they said, Randy, we're curious whether our homebrew, how it compares to the other products on the market, because we know how much it costs for us to make this ourselves. And they make it in truckload quantities. Whoa. They're not buying pounds. They're buying it by the ingredients by the ton and mixing it together. Okay. So they have very much, due to scale, they can make theirs very, very cheaply. Yeah. So they said, I said, well, if you want to kick in some money, I'd be happy to run this trial. So this was funded by beekeeper donations, so I can be independent of any manufacturer. Yeah. And then, so we ran this trial of 7 different substitutes, and then the negative sugar control. We didn't bother with the positive control in this one. And it was a brutal summer. We're still in the middle of a really bad drought. California normally has droughts from time to time. That's our natural. Climate change has exacerbated that. So we are right now in a drought that we haven't seen for 1,200 years in California. Really? Yeah, that's the latest. Yeah, okay.
I read your news letter. It's
yeah, it's been brutal out here. Yeah. So anyway, and it was exceptionally hot and exceptionally low humidity this last year. So the colonies, actually, we were unable to get them to grow over the course of the summer with the pollen sub, where the in previous years, we can normally get them in the same yards at the same time to actually gain strength from the pollen subs. And this is going to be my experimentation this coming season now to figure out precisely why they didn't grow, despite being fed ad libitum and continually with high quality subs. We were unable to get them to grow. So now we got to do a much deeper dive into the cues, environmental cues given to the nurse bees, that the nurse bees have to decide whether they are going to raise a larva from an egg laid by the queen. So all during this trial, the queens continue to lay eggs. You could open the hives any day and see eggs. The question is whether the nurse bees cannibalize those eggs or whether they decide to produce jelly and feed the larvae and grow those larvae to maturity. The year before, they had decided to feed them. This last year, they decided to cannibalize them instead. So this is normal colony behavior of how the honeybee colony deals with food availability in the environment. There's no reason to try to increase the size of your colony if there's nothing out there in the environment to gather, because that would just lead to starvation from all the extra mouths to feed. So if you want to artificially stimulate a colony to grow, you not only got to provide the protein and the sugar necessary, but you need to cue the nurse bees to shift their behavior from larval cannibalism to larval feeding. And so that's what I find to be one of the very interesting things. It's not just what you put in the hive as far as a diet, it's exactly how you provide that within the hive. So this will be an interesting thing to follow up on. Anyway, let's get back to this year's trial. So we did fed them sugar syrup and pollen sub. As soon as the first colonies were finishing up the most attractive patties, we fed everybody and removed any uneaten pollen sub and weighed that. We made sure that they always had plenty of sugar syrup as a substitute for nectar coming in, and always had open cells of that nectar in the hives. And actually, over the course of the summer, they filled an entire deep super full of sugar syrup and or nectar honey. So even though there was no pollen coming in to speak of, they all gained weight as far as stored honey, to the point that we actually had to swap combs around to make sure that they had room, that they wouldn't plug out their brood nest. So it was not a lack of sugar in any way. It was just whether or not they utilized the protein to grow. And what we found was, and then we took them over winter. We didn't feed when they in November. They as it cooled down, they shut down their brood rearing. Yeah. And then come middle of December, we got unseasonably warm middle of winter weather, where the bees actually started initiating some brood rearing, which they don't normally do until middle of January. So it was almost a month early because of the warm winter. So we started feeding pollen sub and sugar syrup again in December to allow them to build their colonies up. And at that point, they did indeed start to grow the size of their populations. Another thing I did, I worked in collaboration with a researcher from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and shipped him off samples of bees at the midpoint grading in November. And he analyzed, he also paid to have all this, get a nutritional analysis of all the subs. So now we could look deep into them, look at their sugar content, look at their lipid content, look at their protein content, and their amino acid, individual amino acids.
What did the manufacturers say to that?
Well, the manufacturers, there's no law against
No. But if I would be the manufacturer of Ultra Bee, I would be unhappy with seeing my receipt somewhere in the.
No. All the manufacturers were perfectly fine with that. I know all the manufacturers, They all trust me to be objective and honest.
Okay.
And they actually all provided me. I said, I gave them the chance. I said, okay, you guys, I'm going to test your sub. I'm going to either buy it off the shelf, but if you want to make sure that I get a fresh batch, you're welcome to send it to me. So I got fresh batches of subs from every manufacturer because they want to make sure I didn't pick up something that had been sitting on the shelf for six months. So although they didn't support the trial financially, they did provide freshly made pollen sub. And no, they're all ears on this. They would like to improve their subs, and I make sure that in every email I email all of them at the same time, so there's no preference. So they all got the results. Anyway, okay, so back to the Vince Rosigliano, who is the USDA researcher. So he did the analyses of the subs, shopped it out to a lab that did the analyses of the ingredients, not the ingredients. See, it's not the ingredients you analyze; it's just the protein, the fat, the lipids, that kind of stuff. So there's nothing proprietary about that. And he also dissected the bees, dried their heads and thoraxes, and weighed them to see whether when bees, their head and thorax weights are good indicators for how well they utilize the protein, because they put it into their flight muscles and into their hypopharyngeal glands. So he measured head and body weight, or head and thorax weight, and what he found was that correlated very much with colony strength going into the winter. So measuring head and thorax weight is a good proxy, and possibly cheaper to measure than actually doing the whole field trial. So that was a good validation that the correlation was very, very tight between overall colony strength and the head and thorax weight, indicating that it wasn't from the environment, it was from the fed diet, because of the correlation with the diet. The other thing he did is he looked at the gut microbiome, the bacteria that live in the gut. And this was a very interesting thing, because two of those diets contain natural pollen, one at 14% and one at 15% and one at 20%. Now, the beekeeper would think, well, since those bacteria evolved to feed upon natural pollen in the bee gut, you might expect the bacterial community to do best on a diet that contains a large amount of natural pollen. That would probably be any beekeeper's assumption.
Yeah.
And we would be completely wrong. This is the one thing, Jan, that I found in over all these years of doing bee research is it's so easy to convince yourself that something will be a certain way, and the bees will just prove you wrong over and over again. The easiest person to fool or to convince is yourself. And as a researcher, you need to just, my goal as a researcher is to prove myself wrong. Okay. I continually want to prove myself wrong. That's the most exciting thing to me, to realize I don't have it figured out. And it's much more interesting than what the solution or the understanding that I came up with. It leads you into a much better understanding of the bees. In what we actually found out was that the amount of pollen made no difference to the bacterial community structure. The same proportions of the bacteria were the same across all diets, that those bacteria do just fine on pollen on an artificial diet as they do on natural pollen. And then as far as bacterial abundance, not just community structure, but the number of bacteria in the guts, the highest was in one of the diets with the natural pollen, and the second lowest was in the diet with a large amount of natural pollen. So there was no correlation between either the structure of the community or the total number of bacteria. There was also no relation to the amount of lipid, which there's a lot of research suggesting by some researchers who are on the like the omega-3 fatty acids bandwagon, saying the bees need that, or they need certain sterols or all this. The results did not support that hypothesis either. nor did the sugars, or nor did even the protein percentage in the patty correlate. So we then went and started feeding again in December, as I said. Let them build up until it was ready to take them to almond pollination. And then I wondered, well, what's the best metric for me to analyze these by? And since I get paid $25 per every frame of bee covered with bees that I go to almond pollination, I said, well, why don't I, out of each group of 18 colonies, so each of the diets had 18 colonies divided by 3 different yards. So we replicated the trial in 3 yards to see if the results were consistent. And this is very important in research, to replicate. One trial means nothing if it can't be replicated. So we got essentially the same results in all 3 yards. So I said, well, what if I just did the total, we graded all the colonies for strength, which is how we are paid in almond pollination. It's we get paid by how many frames are covered with bees.
You know, there was one critic in Germany that's saying, well, this is not a scientific method of counting bees. Just looking at it and counting the frames. I was like, yeah, well, it's Randy Oliver. If he says this is a strong colony, you believe him. I mean, he got experience like no one else. But but you're totally right. If this is,
that's how we get paid.
Exactly. Then this is the right way to measure it.
The people who pay it don't give a shit about the Liebefeld method. Exactly. And I have huge issues with the Liebefeld method.
Yeah.
Not only is it extremely invasive and extremely time consuming, but if you're not doing it at the same time of day for all colonies, there's questions on that. And it's very much independent upon the grader. So what we do is because we've been grading colonies for almonds. They call them almonds if you're down there. They don't call them almonds. So during the time of year when we're putting them in there, my pronunciation shifts to almonds because I talk to the farmers, and then the rest of the year I call them almonds.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, as far as that, my sons and I, the 3 of us, we have years of experience in doing this. So we will grade them independently without speaking to each other, and then compare our grades. And we will generally get within a quarter frame per colony of strength. So we have calibrated ourselves that we are very consistent at grading. And since that's the way we get paid, essentially $25 per frame of bees, I said, well, that's what puts money in my pocket. Let's just grade it by that. And what we get paid for is total number of frames. So I just simply added the total frames out of each 18 colonies that we would have gotten paid for. So that worked out as a very realistic for the beekeeper assessment of colony strength. And there was a monster difference. The interesting finding is for me to try to tease out why there was a difference. We made 3.5 times as much money, 3.5 times as many frames of bees in the best diet fed group as to the sugar control group. 3.5 times as many frames of bees out of that. So there was a very big difference. So anybody who's saying that there's no benefit to feeding pollen sub has never done a field trial in California, and probably doesn't make their living off of supplying bees for almond pollination.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Right. So my research is not directed at getting published so that I can promote my status in my lab or get funded. My research is for the benefit of beekeepers who are trying to make their living with bees. And so, and it's a very clear, to be clear, beekeepers in other countries may not be almond pollinators. And for even for the recreational beekeepers in the area, I don't necessarily recommend feeding pollen sub in the spring because that would simply lead to early swarming. And if they're not going to almonds, then there's no reason to feed pollen sub in the spring. But if your income is based upon having strong colonies of bees in late February, well, then you really do need to build them up earlier, and you deal with the swarming issue afterwards. We split all our colonies because they're very strong when they come out of almonds then.
Yeah.
So then I did a deep dive into trying to figure out why some subs outperformed others. And we could very quickly rule out the lipid content, the sugar, the protein percentage. And really, there wasn't much evidence that having the presence of natural pollen in the diet made a difference. So what that came down to is the essential amino acids.
Mm-hmm.
And for this, we go back to some groundbreaking research by Antonius de Groot back from 1953, when I was only 2 years old. At that time, that was the beginning of research into essential amino acids in animal diets.
Yeah.
And every other livestock industry went from that early 50s research and now has artificial diets on the market or feeding recommendations for pig, for cattle, for chicken, anything you grow. You have a different diet with a different essential amino acid ratio at every stage of growth based upon experimental research. For the beekeeping industry worldwide, our current state of knowledge is from 1953. We have, it's just amazing that we have not progressed from de Groot's research. Now, de Groot did incredible and tedious research. I take my hat off to him. Then it's all about the interpretation. And he was very clear in his study. It's like a 70-page study that there were questions about that. And that it was, this was groundbreaking research and open to interpretation. So for me to reinterpret his research, he would not have any trouble with that if he were still alive, because he was very clear on that in his paper. And that's what I did. I reinterpreted his research, looked at it very closely, and found that the best way for me to, the strongest correlation that I could find with colony performance by the end of the trial was by plotting it against the number of amino acid deficiencies based upon de Groot's research in each of the diets. And I got an R-squared value of 85%, 85% of the variation based upon that. I'll tell you, in a biological field trial, you never get an R-squared value that high. That is just like astounding to be able to predict to 85%. And I'll tell you, and it would have probably been even a higher percentage prediction if one of the patties hadn't had the thyme oil added to it, which made it less phagostimulatory, less attractive to the bees. I think it would have fallen closer to that line. We might have been up to a 90% R value. The probability of having that high a correlation was 4 chances out of 1,000. So that when you see something with an R-squared value of 85% and a probability of 4 chances out of 1,000, you say, well, this is probably not a spurious correlation. This is probably a causal correlation.
Yeah.
So then what I did is I developed a calculator in a spreadsheet in Excel that anybody can use, that you can punch in your diet components, put in some soy flour, put in some brewer's yeast, put in whatever, or put in the analysis for whatever raw ingredient you have. And it immediately calculates out and shows you how closely your diet essential amino acid ratio matches the ideal ratio suggested by de Groot, and also what my suggested amino acid ratio is. I went a step beyond de Groot. He pointed out the limitations of his trial, and looking at what we've learned since then, I have a very slight suggested ratio, slightly different from his, not very much different from his. But this amino acid calculator now allows you to put together a diet. And if your raw ingredients that you have available for you, and I do this for beekeepers internationally who don't necessarily have the raw ingredients that we have in the United States, you can then buy off the shelf, buy them online, amino acid concentrates. And they only have to be added at a very tiny amount to balance the essential amino acids at low cost. So you can then, my calculator allows you to put that in, say for every 100 pounds, put in an ounce, a tiny amount, a few grams of this concentrate, and that brings everything into balance.
Is that calculated on your website already? Or?
Yeah, it's on the website. It's up there for anybody to use.
Cool.
And now we need to test it out. We need to test that. We need to run another trial. And one of the manufacturers approached me for doing that this last summer, but they didn't get their act together quick enough. So maybe it'll happen this summer. We may be running another one where we test out a product and then an improved product and test them side by side to see whether adjusting the amino acid ratio does indeed predict performance. Yeah. So this is very exciting. We may be able to take a big step forward and catch up from 1953 to 2022 in one step on figuring out how to make better artificial diets.
Yeah. How cool is that?
How cool? Exactly. And this is the amazing thing is I thought this was going to be a one article write-up on this. There were 10 separate articles to just of my analysis of what we learned in this trial. So it turned out to be an extremely interesting trial to go into this kind of depth.
Yeah, one question lead to 5 other questions, right?
Oh, exactly. Time and again. Yeah. I can't even tell you how many hours I spent, looking at the data and graphing it out 100 different ways for each component, looking at it. And, so the article, those 10 articles are the summary of what would have been 100 articles if I had shown everything, all my analysis.
Unbelievable. I don't know. I just can say thank you for that, because we really feel how much effort and time you put in this, and how much it brings just to us normal beekeepers back, and not for, as you said, not for reputation or stuff like that. But it's
right. Yeah. No, I don't care about that. Here's the point. You just said the word normal beekeepers.
Yeah.
I correspond with not large commercial beekeepers, but small beekeepers who support their families on the honeybees. And I correspond them worldwide. Yeah. So on this, I'm currently corresponding closely with one from Greece and another one from Spain, who are also looking into this. And they say, Randy, my family depends upon me making money, to feed ourselves with their beekeeping. And I'm way more interested in them than the 20,000 hive commercial beekeeper in the United States who's driving a new pickup truck. Okay. That's what really motivates me. It's helping out the small beekeeper who really needs to find ways to better manage their bees. So, and I collaborate with them, and I suggest, research that they can do themselves, and we all come up with this together, working together.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. I got some questions here.
Okay.
But you answered most of them, and some of them may sound stupid now. I'll raise them anyway.
Good.
No, we have kind of the same broodless period as you have when you said that, because I was wondering, the weather turns bad here sometimes already in October, most of the time in November. So our bees go broodless around end of November, beginning of December. Then start brood rearing again in mid of January, end of January, something like that.
Okay, yeah, very similar.
Yeah. So the difference is, we have years where there is no possibility for a cleansing fly from November to February.
Oh, that is a big difference.
Yes. Sometimes, my bees had 2 days this year where they could fly. The rest of it's just raining, and it's cold, and it's windy, and the sun is not shining here. This is a special year. It's really wet and rainy. Anyway, I was thinking about, you put something like 450 grams on every feeding in the hives, if I remember well.
Yeah.
This is a lot of fiber that you put in there. Your bees could fly. What if...
Well, we did not feed during the broodless period.
No, but what did you say? Beginning of December, when it was exceptionally warm.
Right, but but they're able to fly then.
Yeah. But if we start brood rearing starts now in end of January. So we usually put pollen patties in there at this time, maybe mid of February. But then, what if we don't have cleansing flights until end of March? for 1.5 months. Is there anything what you say, okay, if you're not in California and your bees couldn't fly, just be sure that you don't put too much fiber in there, so you don't feed 2 pounds, 3 pounds, whatever of that.
Okay, so cleansing flights are not so much for fiber. They're for water in the rectum. It's not the fiber that's the issue. And this is some very interesting research suggested by Omho and Mibis back in the 1970s, which for some unfathomable reason, no researcher has followed up on their observations. And what they suggested is that midwinter brood rearing, which we see in colonies around the world, that even in the middle of winter, in the coldest winters, you will see colonies, especially when there's no weather for cleansing flights, initiate some brood rearing.
Yeah.
And their hypothesis is that is done to deal with water balance. Because if they start rearing brood, they can absorb the moisture back out of their rectums and feed it out in the form of jelly.
Yeah, I heard that. Yeah.
And that I find to be fascinating, that may be a big issue. Another interesting thing is years ago, I was using fluorescent tracers. So adding a ultraviolet fluorescent tracer to patty that I was feeding to the colonies. And then I could later on take a group of freeze bees, take samples, freeze them. And I made grids on black paper that I had 50 X's, and I could put a bee on each one and then put a piece of plastic over them and crush 50 bees at a time. Yeah. Then look at them under black light, and that would show me which bees had that fluorescent tracer in their guts, or which bees had pollen in their guts. You didn't even need the tracer for the pollen, and used white paper for a background for that. And most of the year, only a fraction, maybe 25% of the bees or so, contain pollen in their guts. The rest are older bees that are not eating pollen. Come November, 100% of the bees in a hive had guts full of pollen. So it appears that the bees intentionally enter winter with their guts as full of pollen as possible. Okay. I find, and I published this a number of years ago, and I've encouraged researcher after researcher, please to follow up upon this, and nobody's bothered to do it. But that's another fascinating avenue of research to figure out, why would suddenly it shift in November that every single bee in the hive. So these are obviously what are the diutinous bees, or the winter bees. So instead of going into nursing and directing their production, their physiology into producing jelly for feeding larvae, they instead put it into their fat bodies for long-term survival over the winter. And the bees do need some protein over the winter for optimal performance. De Groot found that back in the 1950s, that they do need some protein during the winter, or they lose body mass, and they can lose something like a third of their body mass by utilizing up their protein stores if they don't have some stored bee bread in the hive or some supplemental protein coming in. So my guess is that there's a reason why the bees would fill their guts full of pollen going into November, that they're probably letting the gut microbiome slowly tease out any residual protein out of there, utilizing that nitrogen in there. And you look at it from a colony, biologically, a colony is going to want to go into the winter holding as much protein as possible. So if it's not stored in the combs as bee bread, the safest place to store protein is not in the combs, because there's other organisms that can utilize it then. The safest place to store protein is in your body, whether it's in the fat bodies or whether it's in your gut. So since bees have been doing this for a long time, you're concerned about the fiber in the diet may not have biological justification, since the bees appear to prefer to go into the winter with a gut full of fiber.
As I said, I look stupid when I raise my questions, but
no, it's a very good question. And only reason I can answer this is that I had the same question.
Okay.
There's nothing stupid about that question. and then look at this, look at this, and put together all the pieces of what I've either found in literature. Here's one of the things I found, Jan, is that many researchers nowadays think that there's been nothing of interest published that's older than 5 years old. They never go back to all the fantastic research that was published back in the early 1900s, 1950s. And I got to tell you, the German researchers, the history, like Karl Kreilsheim, other German researchers, you guys have a very long history of top-notch bee research coming out of Germany. And much of that older research is very much worth reading. What was interesting is when we had the invasion of Nosema ceranae in the United States, which occurred between 2001 and about 2008. That's the invasive wave. And at that time, we had this phenomenon called colony collapse disorder. Yeah. The symptoms of which were exactly identical to the symptoms of Nosema disease. Yeah. Okay. From me, and I studied it quite a bit, and to me, Nosema ceranae, the invasion, had very much to do with that wave of colony losses that we had. And people were all up in arms thinking, they had to learn all about Nosema ceranae from scratch. And all they had to do is look back to a paper that was published in 1909, which would have answered all their questions back then by a guy named E.W. White, who spent 9 years studying Nosema apis for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, wrote this whole treatise on all his findings. And that was the most informative thing there was. When I read that and studied that paper, I said, what are you guys talking about? All this having to learn about Nosema ceranae. It's no different than, only slightly different than Nosema apis. And he's already got it all that information there. So I'm disappointed with a lot of the researchers don't go back and review. And his paper was not cited in virtually I don't think it was ever cited in a single paper on Nosema ceranae that was published.
Yeah.
Yeah. Isn't that, it's unbelievable, huh?
Yeah, it's really unbelievable. Last question.
Okay.
It's really, I said I'll use 30 minutes of your time. So really last question. So you wrote that almost 90% of US beekeepers are using supplements.
No. I never wrote that. So hang on a second. Here's something really important. The majority of honeybee of hives in the United States go to almond pollination.
Yeah, I know.
That accounts for a tiny fraction of the number of beekeepers. The vast majority of hives in the United States are managed by a handful of beekeepers who are running 20,000 colonies and going to almond pollination. Yeah. So the small scale beekeepers are a whole different subset than that. So that
I misunderstood.
Right. To clarify, it's a huge difference right there. Yeah. Again, if you're not going to almond pollination, you manage your bees differently because building them up to be huge colonies in February just leads to swarming issues later on if you're not an almond pollinator.
Yeah. Well, it's for us, our pollination season for at least the ones that are doing it are starting in beginning of April. Okay. So, but last year in April we had snow. So we are looking forward to something where we say, okay, our bees have all the nutrition, everything they need to build up, so that when the weather turns better in April, they are ready. Yes. So if there's no natural pollen, we need to give them something. That's what we think. So the question now is, what do you suggest for German beekeepers who don't have access to all of those products that you have in the US? Is homebrew, including natural pollen, something which could replace?
Certainly. I don't know if there's any need for the natural pollen in that. That is, that's what we hope to find out soon. And by using my calculator, you can find out what ingredients you have available for yourself. And I have when I do my PowerPoints, I have a slide of me treating my bees better than I treat my own children. And it's a picture I took some years ago of my two sons when they were younger, out in the rain with foul weather rubber raincoats and rain pants on, feeding protein to our colonies. And my point is, when people who question that, he said, Randy, you're out working in the rain and the snow, feeding your colonies. I said, well, duh, when it's warm and sunny, they feed themselves. If you're a beekeeper, it's your job when the weather is miserable to go out and give them food if they need that. So in answer to your question, because here in the foothills of California, the mountains where I live, it may rain for 30 days in a row in March or April.
Yeah.
We may work 30 days in a row wearing full foul weather gear, rain gear, every single day out taking care of our colonies, because we are keepers of our bees. We're practicing good bee husbandry. And if they can't get out and get food, and we want them to perform when the honey flow arrives, then we do that. And so in answer to your question, yeah, there are things that the beekeeper can do when we get snow sometimes in April. Also, it sounds like our conditions are where I live, pretty similar. Oh yeah,
maybe. Well, I'm not sure if you're ever close to Hamburg. Give me a call. I show you.
Okay, yeah. Where people think California means Southern California and the beaches. Okay, I grew up down there. I live up in the mountains of California in deep forest. Yeah. Very, very tall trees, and we do get winter here. I live an hour's drive from one of the places that is often the coldest temperature in the continental United States on days. Yeah. So that's a couple thousand feet above me, but just only an hour's drive up the road. So California is much more diverse than what you see in Hollywood.
Okay. Cool. All right. Thank you very, very much. That was it was an honor for me to speak to you.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I hope you are aware about that, but you have a very high reputation here in Germany.
Well, thank you.
A lot of people are reading your website regularly. We are exchanging about that. It's whenever there's something new, it goes through all the groups, and everyone is like, "Have you read that?" and so on. What do you think? So,
Jan, that I'll just tell you, that is what keeps me going. Yeah. The feedback from beekeepers in all these small countries. One thing I got a postcard one year from a nun, religious nun from Estonia, and said, and I didn't even know Estonia existed, and I checked it out, and actually sounds like a really neat country. Yeah. And and finding out that I had a following in Estonia, that just as you said, I said, that makes my life worthwhile. Yeah. I don't do this for the money. I do it because, my contribution to the beekeeping community. So I got to tell you, when you tell me that just makes me glow to find that my work is of value to other people. It
is definitely. Last word on money is all of your studies, researches, and so on are funded by beekeepers.
Right.
Like me.
By contributions from beekeepers, yes.
Yeah. So if you now feel that you could contribute to that, I'll post the link. Of course, the link is here. So thank again.
Thank you, Jan. Yeah, sure.
That was really, as I said, really an honor for me. Yeah, I wish you all the best for almond pollination, which is already ongoing. And
already ongoing, yes. I hope to be down there tomorrow, actually, in there. Yeah. And it's exciting. We got spring coming on. It's another year. One more year to see how we do.
Perfect. Randy, thank you very much, and see you soon.
My pleasure. Take care, Jan.